I spent 17 years in the Middle East before coming to Connecticut and taking my current job. And during those 17 years, I spent a lot of time in refugee camps. Refugee camps in Pakistan, Gaza Strip, Lebanon, Somalia. And what I remember most from those visits to refugee camps was not so much the squalid conditions, the raw sewage running down the street, the thousands of tents, the despair, the disarray. No, what I remember most from visiting refugee camps was the amazing hospitality that refugees showed me. I mean, there I was coming from the wealthiest, most powerful country on earth. They had every reason to be angry and unfriendly. They had strong feelings about U.S. government foreign policy, but they set all that aside. When I showed up, they treated me like an honored guest. They gave me a lesson in hospitality and generosity that I have never forgotten. And I would sometimes say to them while I was sipping that very sweet tea or the cardamom-flavored coffee, I'd say in the Arabic that I'd learned as a Peace Corps volunteer years before, you know, Ahmed or Fatima, if you ever come to the United States, I want you to look me up. I want to show you American hospitality. I want to show you the same kind of hospitality that you have shown me. Well, that was a long time ago. But as fate would have it, that's what I've been doing for the past 14 years. I've been the director of a refugee resettlement agency based in New Haven, and our mission is to welcome refugees from all over the world and help them start new lives. And what is a refugee? We have to start on the same page here. The international law definition of a refugee is a person who has fled his or her home country because of persecution. Persecution because of their race, their religion, their nationality, their particular social group, or even their political opinion. There are 26 million refugees in the world today. A tiny fraction of those 26 million have an opportunity to resettle in another country. And the US government, for years, has had the largest refugee resettlement program in the world. We used to invite more refugees to the United States than all of the other governments with refugee programs put together. That is not the case anymore. But how does the refugee resettlement program work? Well, it begins overseas. Our Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security send representatives to refugee camps all around the world, and they sit down and they interview people. The Department of Homeland Security runs refugees through the most rigorous vetting process in the world. It takes an average of 2 years. The CIA is involved. The FBI is involved. They run all kinds of information through international databases, terrorist watch lists, criminal databases. They make sure that refugees who are invited to the United States are not going to pose a security threat. Once you pass through that, you have a health screening. And once you make it through that, you're then assigned to one of 200 refugee resettlement agencies based in the United States. We are one of those proud refugee resettlement agencies. So the refugee family is placed with a resettlement agency in the United States, and then they're asked to sign a loan agreement form to repay the cost of the airfare to bring them to the United States. That's right, refugees cover their airfare to come to the United States. Now, while all of this is happening overseas, here in the United States, the Refugee Resettlement Agency receives an email that says, family of 5 from the Congo, or maybe it's a family of 4 from Afghanistan, is arriving in 2 weeks. My staff has to immediately mobilize, find an apartment, furnish it with donated furniture, stock the kitchen with 3 days' worth of food, find someone in the neighborhood who can cook a culturally appropriate hot meal to serve this family soon after they arrive, appropriate to their culture. So it's not McDonald's Happy Meal that they prepare. It is a culturally appropriate hot meal. All of this is readied, and then the family arrives at the airport. They are met by someone from the United Nations. The refugee family takes a shuttle, a minivan to New Haven. There, my case manager meets them. If it's a cold day like today, they're bundled up in donated winter coats, hats, scarves, and gloves. They're driven to their apartment. Children are thrilled when they see age-appropriate toys laid out nicely on their beds. They have that culturally appropriate hot meal, have a good night's sleep. And then the next day, my staff will bring them to the office, and they go over the program. They sit them down in the case management room, and they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. First things first, some of you have some health issues. We're going to connect you to health care. Next, we're going to enroll the kids in school. After that, we're going to make sure the parents are enrolled in English language classes. And we're going to help you get a job. Now, we have to do all of this as quickly as possible because we don't have that much money. And because we don't have that much money, it means we don't have that much time. But before you know it, the kids are learning English like rockets. They're winning academic awards. Of course, they're excelling on the soccer field. The parents are learning English, not as quickly as the kids. They're getting jobs. They're beginning to pay their rent and cover their other expenses. They're gradually becoming self-sufficient and integrating into their communities. Refugee resettlement is one of the most amazing programs that happens in this country. It's one of the best things we do. It is our nation's oldest and most noble tradition. It's one of our best foreign policy programs. And it's happening right here in our backyards. Why don't more Americans know about it? Well, that's an interesting question, and you have to look at the history of refugee resettlement to answer that question. We know that for hundreds of years, refugees have been coming to the United States, and most of them were welcomed and resettled by friends or relatives, people from their nationality, church groups, synagogues, some charitable groups were involved, but it was generally a very informal system. It was short on money, and it was short on organization, but it was really strong on community involvement and the engagement of private citizens. Well, in 1980, Congress signed the Refugee Act. And from that point on, the US government organized refugee resettlement. They allocated a budget for it, and they privatized it. They delegated the work to nonprofit groups, private voluntary organizations. And as those private voluntary organizations became more and more professional and did more and more refugee resettlement, the involvement of private citizens and community groups began to drop off. And that's one reason why a lot of people in this country are not really aware of the refugee resettlement program. Over the past 40 years, 3 million refugees have been welcomed and resettled in the United States. I have to say that we have done a pretty good job, the refugee resettlement groups have done a pretty good job of providing those basic services to refugees. We have done a poor job of educating Americans and engaging the public in the process. Nonprofit groups focused on those services for refugees, pretty much worked by ourselves, kept a low profile. You could say we kind of flew under the radar. Well, it's no mystery then that Americans don't know much about refugee resettlement. In fact, there are elected officials who aren't even aware of the refugee resettlement program. And if people aren't aware of a program, you can expect them to support it. Well, today everybody knows that public support for refugee resettlement is critically important. The question is, how do you accomplish that? How do we educate Americans about refugees and refugee resettlement? And how do we build up public support for this great American tradition? Well, I say we harness that incredible enthusiasm and power of the volunteer spirit in this country. Now, I work at a refugee resettlement agency just down the road in New Haven. And whenever I see a new volunteer in the office, I'll ask him or her, look, I'll say to them, there are tons of nonprofits in Connecticut. Why did you come here? Why are you volunteering at a refugee resettlement agency? And they'll inevitably say something like, you know, I've been watching the news. I see all the wars going on, the suffering around the world, the massive movement of people drowning trying to cross the Mediterranean. I mean, the world is facing the worst refugee crisis ever. And I see the chaos and the disarray in Washington, D.C. And I say to myself, I just have to do something. I have to do something. Well, you know, there are millions of Americans who are saying this. I just have to do something. And there are 200 refugee resettlement agencies spread across the United States who can take advantage of this spirit of volunteerism. Help people do something. So we here in Connecticut have taken a page out of the past, and we've been engaging community groups. We've been recruiting groups of people from communities across the state, and we're telling them, we are going to train you on how to resettle refugees. We'll give you a training manual also, and then we're going to place a refugee family in your community. You don't have to drive all the way to New Haven and volunteer there. We're going to place a refugee family in your community. Once you've learned how to take care of them, get them off to a good start, we're there to help if you need it. We'll be partners in this. But basically, all of the tasks of resettling refugee, we are going to hand over to you. It'll be your responsibility. Well, amazing things happen when you give a lot of responsibilities to a group. I don't know what it is. Is it peer pressure? Is it some group dynamic? But they do incredible things. They turn into super volunteers. They do a tremendous job. It seems that the more responsibility you give someone, the deeper their experience and the more satisfaction they get out of it. When you talk to people who have resettled refugees as part of a community group, they'll say things like, oh my God, this was the best thing we've ever done. I was working with other volunteers from the town, people I didn't even know existed. I learned so much about the world, about the refugees. I learned about the United States. In fact, I feel we got more out of this experience than we gave to the refugee family we resettled. Now, I have to say, I have a lot of colleagues involved in refugee resettlement all over the country. They're not convinced that this community-based model is the best. They say to me, Chris, do you really place a vulnerable, needy refugee family with this group of semi-retired, baby boomer, amateur do-gooders? And I say, yes. Yes, we do. We work with coalitions that represent all social and political, religious parts of the community. We work with groups that are between 50 and 100 people in size. I give you an idea of the kind of people who sign up to be in these volunteer groups. Retired superintendent of schools, part-time social worker, retired cardiologist whose parents came from Lebanon years ago, retired Wall Street executive, a former member of a town council, a political science teacher and half of her class, a Girl Scout troop, the pastor of a local church and the youth group, the rabbi from a nearby synagogue, the imam from the nearby mosque, and the manager of a used car dealership. You can train these people, help them along the way, provide some oversight, and they will do an incredible job of resettling refugees. And they have the credibility and the respect of their community. So as they're gathering furniture and raising funds and being trained by my professional staff, they might hold a town hall meeting. And someone in the town hall meeting might stand up and say to the Refugee Resettlement Committee, as they're talking about the upcoming arrival of a refugee family, someone might stand up and say, "Excuse me, but we have people in this town who are suffering, who've lost their jobs and lost their homes, people born here. Why aren't we helping them? Why do you want us to help this family from another country? Shouldn't we be focusing on our own kind?" So instead of me, a guy who grew up in New Jersey, jumping in my car and driving up to this town hall meeting as an outsider and dealing with that question, instead, a member of the town, a member of the committee, grabs the microphone and says, "Sam, thank you for coming tonight. Sam, you and I both grew up in this town, and you know as well as I do that we have the resources not only to help people from this town, but we can also welcome a family that's fleeing persecution and help them start a new life in this country. The same way, Sam, that your grandparents were helped when they came. So Sam, thank you for coming tonight, and I hope you'll be part of this committee." Community-based refugee resettlement is a grassroots movement, not just in Connecticut, but around the world. A grassroots movement that has the respect of members of the community. Community-based refugee resettlement can bring Americans together. And it can also help us increase the number of refugees that we bring to this country. In 2016, my organization was able to double the number of refugees that we resettle because we had dozens of community groups supporting us, including one from New London, which over the past 4 years has welcomed 5 refugee families. So let's hear it for New London. So this is happening across Connecticut, and it can happen in every state in the country. In Canada, which is the world's leader in refugee resettlement, 300,000 refugees were resettled over the past 40 years by 500 communities, towns and villages across Canada. Community-based resettlement has the potential to dramatically increase public support for refugee resettlement. And when you increase public support for refugee resettlement, you can increase political support for refugee resettlement. And that can lead to a change in government policy, so we'll be bringing more refugees to the United States than the low number that we see this year. And one day, in the near future, the US government will once again play a leading role in welcoming refugees from all over the world. That will encourage other nations to do the same. That will lead to thousands more lives being saved, thousands more children having a future. And for those 26 million refugees sweating it out in the dismal despair of refugee camps, they'll have more hope that one day they might be able to rebuild their lives in safety and freedom. Thank you.